Risk analysis is another key concept that you really need to know. If we don't know which assets we have, or what their value is, or how bad it is if they're compromised, how can we put effective countermeasures in place? How would we know what to protect? Let's begin by looking at some of the key concepts. Qualitative risk analysis is just sitting down and guessing how likely is this to happen, how bad is it if it happens, and how exposed are we. It's vague, it's guessing, it's feelings, it's pretty quick to do, and we mostly use it to identify the areas where we want to do the quantitative risk analysis. Think of qualitative risk analysis as the quality of something. That's pretty good. That's nice. It's not a specific number, it's more of an opinion. Which then leads us into quantitative risk analysis. This is where we put actual numbers on the assumptions. If this happens, how much will it cost us? It's fact-based analysis. We'll look at the cost of the asset, cost of a compromise, and math is involved. Some of the other key terms you need to know for the certification and for your job in regards to risk analysis is threat. A threat is a potential harmful incident. Really anything that can cause damage to your organization or to your data. Whereas a vulnerability is a weakness that can actually allow the threat to come to fruition. A tsunami might be a threat, but if your data center is up in the mountains, it's not a vulnerability. For you it might be snow, volcanic activity, whatever else can harm you in your area. And when we look at risk, the risk is the threat multiplied by the vulnerability. And we do at times also add impact, another vector to the equation. In that case, the risk equals threat times vulnerability times impact. It's how bad it is. If we have two data centers right next to each other, and assuming they're identical, the threat and vulnerability would most likely be the same. But if one is manned and the other is unmanned, the impact to the manned one would be much higher. It gives us a clearer picture and a fuller risk analysis. If we then look at the total risk, that's the potential threat times the vulnerability and then times the asset value. And then finally we have the residual risk. That's the total risk minus any countermeasures we do. We'll look at some examples in a bit. When we look at a qualitative risk analysis, we most often use a risk analysis matrix, where we look at the likelihood of an incident happening and how bad it is if it happens. If we take the example of a laptop, how likely is it that it will get stolen or an employee forgets it somewhere? Let's assume it's possible or likely. And then we look at how bad it is if it happens. And again, that really depends on the data on the laptop. Is the laptop encrypted? Is there sensitive data on there? Let's for this example say that there's no confidential data, there's no PHI or PII, but there would be company information. So let's say it's a minor issue. If we look at the risk analysis matrix, we can see that a minor issue that's likely to happen is considered a high risk. This is probably something we should look at the quantitative risk analysis. And if we implement effective countermeasures, it might get moved to a medium or a low. And we would do this for all our assets, both tangible and intangible objects. And that would then move us into the quantitative risk analysis. I've had some students that have issues remembering the difference between the two. And the easiest way I can explain it is quantitative. Think of quantity, it's a number, it's specific. What's qualitative is quality, it's vague, it's your opinion, and separate the two like that. We use the quantitative risk analysis to ensure that we have exactly the right security posture for what we're protecting. You don't want too little security and you don't want too much. You want the exact right amount. So for any given asset, we look at the asset value. How much of the asset is compromised? How much will one incident cost? How often do the incidents occur? And how much that's going to cost us per year? Know these abbreviations and know what they do. To a large extent, they are logical. The asset value, or AV, is how much is the asset worth. The exposure factor, or EF, how much of the asset is lost in an incident. The single loss expectancy, the SLE, is the asset value times the exposure factor. What will this cost us if it happens once? The annual rate of occurrence, or ARO, how often does this happen every year? And then the annual loss expectancy, or ALE, what will this cost us every year if we do nothing? And then finally the TCO, the total cost of ownership. This is the total cost of the mitigation of the countermeasure we put in place to lower the risk and the exposure factor. This is both the initial cost and the ongoing annual cost for maintenance. Let's look at a few examples. Going back to the laptop from earlier, we have an unencrypted laptop that's stolen. The laptop's asset value is $10,000. $1,000 for the actual laptop and $9,000 for the PII that was on the laptop. In this case, the exposure factor would be 100% because the laptop is gone, which then makes our single loss expectancy $10,000. 10,000 times 1. If our company then loses 25 laptops a year, the ALE our annualized loss expectancy would be $250,000. In the example on the right, we have a data center valued at $10 million. If a flooding does happen, we're expected to lose 15% of the data center, so our single loss expectancy would be $10 million times 0.15, $1.5 million. But the flooding only happens every 4 years, so the annual rate of occurrence, 0.25. So 25% of $1.5 million, that will make our annualized loss expectancy $375,000. Let's return to the laptop example and implement a countermeasure. Through our due diligence, we've determined that we want full disk encryption on the laptop and want to be able to wipe them remotely. The full disk encryption and support is going to cost us $75,000 to implement and $5,000 a year. The remote wipe capability is going to cost us $20,000 to implement and $4,000 a year in maintenance. And then finally, we need to hire extra staff to ensure that the laptops are encrypted and we have help desk support for them. That's going to cost us $25,000 a year. In this example, I've used a 4-year tech refresh cycle. So during a full tech refresh cycle, it's going to cost us $1 million. 4 years times the $250,000 we'd lose from the laptops if we do nothing. And implementing the full disk encryption and the remote wipe will cost us $231,000 per tech refresh cycle, which is again 4 years. So really it's only going to cost us $57,750 per year. We can assume the laptops will still be lost, so the $25,000, that's just the laptop value, will still be lost. But the $225,000 that was the loss from the personal identifiable information, we would no longer incur. So by spending the $57,000, we would save $225,000. And this is what we want in all our risk analysis. We want a positive ROI, return on investment. As long as the total cost of ownership is less than the annual loss expectancy, it will make sense to implement this countermeasure. How we respond to the risk after we've done an analysis is determined by the results. We can choose to accept the risk. If in the laptop example it's going to cost us $1 million to implement a countermeasure and we would only save $250,000 a year, it wouldn't be worth doing. In that case, we would accept the risk. We just need to ensure that we've done our due diligence and due care, and we have the paper trail to prove it. In the example with the laptop, we chose risk mitigation. We implemented countermeasures, and we reduced the risk to an acceptable level. The risk that's left over is the residual risk. We can also choose to transfer the risk. The data center example could be a good way to do that. We could buy flood insurance. The flood is obviously still going to happen. We would still lose 15% of the infrastructure, but we'd be insured against it. We wouldn't have to pay the $1.5 million every time it happened. We can also choose risk avoidance. Basically, we make sure that the risk can't happen. So for the laptop example, we can just stop issuing laptops to our employees. Then they can't lose them. Or for the data center, we're going to build in an area that's not prone to flooding. And this would obviously be part of our initial risk analysis before we decide on a site for our new data center. We do our due diligence, we research the area. And then we have risk rejection. This is never okay. That's you knowing the issue is there, the vulnerability is there, but you're ignoring it. You've done your due diligence, but you have not done your due care. You are going to be liable. And finally, we have the term secondary risk. That's when implementing one countermeasure opens up for another vulnerability. That could be you upgrading a software version to the latest version, which then has a vulnerability in it the previous one didn't. If we know about this vulnerability, we do the risk analysis again. And risk analysis is an iterative process. It's never over. Environments are going to be constantly changing. And with that change, we need to do the risk analysis to ensure that we're secure enough. This area is very testable. And to reiterate, qualitative risk analysis, think quality. It's vague, pretty good quality. And quantitative, think quantity. It's a specific number. How many, how much. When we're looking at risk management and risk analysis, it's often smart to use frameworks that are already in place. One of those could be the NIST Special Publication 800-30. It's a 9-step process for risk management. We'd look at the system characteristics, the scopes and boundaries of our risk, the system, and the data sensitivity. Not all systems are created equal. We'd identify the threats, identify the vulnerabilities. Look at our control analysis. What are the current and future planned safeguards, controls, and mitigations we have in place, or we're going to have in place? How likely is it to happen? This is where we'd use our qualitative and quantitative risk analysis. How bad is it if it happens? We'd look at the risk determination. From our qualitative and quantitative risk analysis, we've determined our risks and the associated risk levels. Then we'd come up with recommendations. What should we do? Mitigate, transfer, accept, or whatever risk response we suggest. And then finally, we document it. Document our risk analysis and document our recommendations. This is the paper trail I was talking about earlier. Remember, you don't make the decisions, you make the recommendations. What they do with them is up to senior management. We also need to be aware of who the attackers are. Most often they're just called hackers, which just used to be someone who used something for a purpose it wasn't intended for. Someone smart and innovative that found a new way of using something for something else. The way we use it now, though, is it's anyone who's trying to access or disrupt any leg of the CIA triad, our confidentiality, integrity, or availability. But there are different types of hackers. The white hat hackers are penetration testers. They're looking for flaws in our system so we can fix them. They're also called ethical hackers. Then on the other side is the black hat hackers. These are the malicious attackers who try to find our flaws and exploit them. They can also be referred to as crackers. And then somewhere in the middle is gray hat hackers. They go looking for vulnerable code, system, or products and then publicize the vulnerability. This can in some cases cause problems because when you share the vulnerability, the black hat hackers now know it's there and the software developer hasn't had time enough to develop a patch. Some of them would approach the company, tell them about the vulnerability, allow them to fix it, send out a patch, but if nothing happens, they would publicize. And then finally we have script kiddies. It's a very derogatory term used for someone who has no knowledge, someone who's downloaded tools, but they can still do a lot of damage. They're often just having fun and doing something that they think is cool, having no clue of the consequences. And the hacking tools you can download nowadays are very complex. Just because they have no skill doesn't mean they're not dangerous to us. And these categories are of course very high level. There are hundreds of variations of skill levels, intent, and effect. Outside attackers are by far the ones that launches the most attacks on our systems. But if we have good defense in depth, they're also the least successful. There are many reasons for attackers wanting to attack our organization. They might be showing off for someone. They might be financially motivated. They might not like what we do. And there are obviously many ways they can attack our systems. As we looked at earlier, between 48 and 62% of the risks come from outsiders, which then should make us question, what about insiders? That's our authorized employees, the ones we've given access to our systems. And they may not be malicious, they might just not think about what they're doing, or not understand it's a problem, but the damage is just as bad. Between 38 and 52% of risks come from insiders. And there are many administrative, physical, and technical countermeasures we can put in place to make our network and our data more secure, even from our own people. Another type of attacker could be a hacktivist. It's basically a hacker-activist smushed together, and they're often hacking for political or socially motivated purposes. This could be free speech, human rights, or the freedom of information movement. Some of the high-profile hacktivism cases could be the anonymous DDoS attack on Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal to protest the arrest of Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks. Another well-known example is when Google, Twitter, and Say Now were together to provide communication for the Egyptian people when the government did an internet blackout in 2011 during the Arabian Spring. Hacktivists are awfully highly skilled and can do serious damage. Another threat is state-sponsored hacking. This is very common. These are often attacks only happening regular working hours from the attacker's country. This is a day job. About 120 countries across the world have developed ways to use the internet as a weapon to target financial markets, government computer systems, and utilities. You no longer have to attack a country to destroy its infrastructure. Some of the most famous attacks was the involvement of Russia in the US elections, the Sony websites by North Korea, Stuxnet by the US and Israel, and the hack of the US Office of Personnel Management by China. It's very common, and it's not just the military targets you would think it would be. Imagine how fast you can bring a country to its knees if you stop the water, the power, the production of gasoline, disrupt the internet. All of these things are computer controlled. Within a few weeks or maybe a month, the country will stop functioning. It is somewhat scary, but also something you need to be aware of. Understand the threat landscape you're living in. And understand it's not if you're going to get compromised, but when. It's common for attackers to use bots and botnets to reach their goals. A bot is just a computer system that's been infected with malware, which does whatever the attacker wants, and is normally part of a botnet, which is controlled by a bot herder. The system is often compromised by a remote access Trojan that's installed through a game or an application with a hidden payload, and the bot is controlled through IRC, HTTP, or HTTPS. Some bots are activated as soon as they're infected, and some lay dormant until they're activated. And depending on the attacker's target, data on your system could be compromised or not. They might just use your system to send spam emails, be part of a DDoS attack, or something similar, or they could compromise your system as well and steal your data. A botnet is a CNC network command and control, and like you can see in the graph on the right, the actual owner of the botnet has access to many systems that act as herders, which then in turn connects to the compromised systems and tell them what to do. In large botnets, there can be hundreds of thousands of zombies or infected systems, and if the attacker wants to start a DDoS attack, even if it's just regular traffic, Most websites would be crippled if all of a sudden 100,000 people or 200,000 people try to connect to it. Another very common attack is phishing, but in hacking it's spelled P-H-I-S-H-I-N-G. It's really just phishing spelled with PH instead of F. It's a form of social engineering where the attacker sends fake emails in order to compromise systems, get information from people, or have them pay them money. We've all seen them. It's the click to win, click to claim your $50 Amazon card, or congratulations, your rich uncle left you $1 billion. Send us $5,000 to claim it. Regular phishing attacks are sent to hundreds of thousands of people, and they only need a very, very small percentage to actually be worth it. One of the examples I remember is the public treasurer from Michigan that sent $1.2 million to Nigeria so he could get the $300 million that were in the bank there for him. He sent $1.1 million of taxpayer funds and $72,000 of his own. Even if you send millions and millions of emails, one payday like that is worth it. And this is where we want to train and raise awareness with our users so they don't click on the links. Question the emails they get. And if they're not certain, forward it to IT security. But just like any other attack, the more specific, the better designed, and the more personal the attack is, the higher chances it has of succeeding. That brings us to spear phishing. Spear phishing is targeted phishing. The attacker targets specific individuals, and they have some prior knowledge about the person or the company they work for. The more well-crafted the email is, the higher chance it has of succeeding. And then the final form of phishing is whale phishing. It's a type of spear phishing, but it only targets the senior leadership of an organization. They're interesting targets because they have the decision-making ability, they often don't have a very deep IT understanding, and they want to do what they can to protect the company. One of the common whale phishing emails is sending legal-looking documents to the CFO or CEO saying your company will be sued in 2 weeks if you don't fill out the documentation attached and return it to us. Then the attachment would have a Trojan in it that'll infect their computer. For all of these, we can obviously implement technical measures that'll move them into the spam folder or just filter them out, but user training and awareness is definitely needed as well. You'll also hear talk about vishing. It's voice phishing, which is also a form of social engineering, and those attacks work pretty much the same as the phishing. They can be automated phone messages saying your taxes are due, your account is locked, enter your password to prevent something, or they can be more targeted. It can be a real person, calling with prior knowledge, trying to gain access to information they shouldn't have. For these types of attack, training and awareness is especially important. We can't really filter out phone calls, unless we have an advanced phone filtering system, which almost no one does. You see the repeating pattern here? Train the users, make them aware, help them spot the fake emails, the fake phone calls. This should be an integral part of our layered defense.